Welcome back. Let's continue from our last video. In our previous video, the headmaster of the prestigious magical academy made a momentous announcement. He revealed that within the academy's century-long history, a mere 2 candidates had ever met the rigorous entry standards for the autonomous major. Now a new chapter has been written as Dane has successfully navigated this incredibly challenging selection process. With a voice filled with significance, the headmaster then called for Dane to step forward. The gallery's occupants were astounded by the sheer number of talented individuals who had emerged from the Sogres house, with some even remarking that the heavens had been exceptionally generous to them. Dane's parents were in attendance to watch their son participate in the opening ceremony. "Did you see Dane over there?" his father asked his wife, adding with pride that their son had grown so much and looked good, especially after his first-place win. Duke Thermion offered his congratulations to Arkan, acknowledging his success in raising his 3 children to become exceptional talents. Arkan responded modestly, suggesting that his achievement was insignificant in comparison to the accomplishments of Duke Thermion's children. This comment seemed to trigger a shift in Duke Thermion's expression, a hint of frustration appearing as he privately lamented his 2 sons. Neither had turned out well. One had started school unnoticed, the other had been expelled, and the youngest had even run away. Turning to Arkan, he remarked with envy on Arkan's 2 daughters, to which Arkan responded with a forced smile, reminding him, "But you still have Layla." Duke Thermion then glanced at his daughter, a touch of regret in his eyes, and quietly wished his wife could have been there. Turning to the conversation between Professor Delfiniso and Claire, the professor inquired, "Did Dane get along well with your summons from a young age?" Claire replied, "Yes, Professor." Professor Delfiniso then exclaimed, "As expected. It's that innate friendliness Dane has always possessed right from birth that gives him the ability to form strong bonds with summoned creatures." Delfiniso then observed Dane with a look akin to studying a strange creature, a child without any marks or signs of a summoner, surpassing all others, finding it unbelievable. Not paying much attention to her, Claire voiced a concern, asking Professor if Dane's compatibility was so high, was there a possibility he could summon creatures from beyond the horizon? "Beyond the horizon?" Delfiniso repeated, raising an eyebrow, explaining that it was another world where creatures that vanished 100 years ago were once connected. As for her question, she said, "Who knows, those creatures choose their summoners, so it was possible." Meanwhile, Headmaster Arkwald Homet looked at Dane with a pleased nod, saying so he was the famous Dane Sogres, and that he could freely showcase his talents there at the academy, handing Dane a piece of paper. Seeing this, Dane took the paper from the headmaster's hands and confidently replied that he would remember that. Just then a voice called out to let the representatives of those who passed the exam swear the oath. Time passed quickly and the opening ceremony came to a close. Looking at the piece of paper in his hand, Dane reminded himself that he had finally entered the academy, that it had taken so long to get there, but he wouldn't waste this new life, and that from now on this was a fresh start. The scene shifted to the main lecture hall of the academy, where assistant professors were reminding the new students that the academy introduction was ending there, and they could take a break for now, later enjoying some refreshments and relaxing before the next session. Hearing this, the group of students began chatting excitedly amongst themselves. Meanwhile, Layla, the swordswoman, didn't forget to warn her close friend, telling Dane that there would be many people targeting him from now on, and whether their intentions were good or bad, he needed to be careful. She advised him that if anyone made any offers, he should think carefully about it. She paused for a moment and lowered her voice, mentioning that she had heard that place was full of strange people, those who weren't raised properly at home. Dane, seeing Layla act like a concerned mother on her child's first day of school, couldn't help but feel a bit bored, saying he got it and knew already. Layla immediately noticed that Dane hadn't taken her words too seriously, so she reiterated, telling him not to ignore her and to listen carefully. At the same time, upperclassmen started laughing and running inside, inviting the new students to join their club, cheerfully calling out that they had definitely got some new recruits and to grab that red-haired kid, as he was the talent they had been looking for, inviting students as if they were running a pyramid scheme. Layla sighed, watching the scene, noting that the upperclassmen had already started recruiting new students during the break. As for Dane, this entire situation felt a bit amusing to him, recalling his sister talking about this and thinking there seemed to be a lot of interesting clubs. Unaware of Dane's inner thoughts, the upperclassmen quickly remembered his presence and shouted to each other to find the Sogres kid, the one who ranked first, insisting they must recruit him into their club. As they spoke, they all turned to stare at the protagonist, causing Layla to panic, exclaiming that everyone was targeting him and asking what they should do first, suggesting they get out of there. Layla immediately grabbed Dane's wrist and pulled him away. However, the upperclassmen weren't about to let them escape so easily. "Dane Sogres joined the fitness club where we build perfect physiques," a large upperclassman said enthusiastically. On the other side, a blonde upperclassman added, "Hey noob, how about the map research club? If you join now, you'll get access to a completely new map. Our astrology club gathers the most talented individuals over there. That's the heir of the Thermion family. We can't let our precious lady escape." They continued chasing the two, acting like zombies chasing fresh meat. Layla, hearing this, was completely overwhelmed by their enthusiasm, shouting desperately that she wasn't joining. Meanwhile, the chase itself felt strangely familiar to Dane. He mused inwardly that he was used to being chased by enemies, but this was the first time for something like this, grumbling that being at the top of the list really was exhausting. Time flew by and the setting changed to a hallway where a calmly walking professor sparked hushed whispers among the assistants. One asked if it was Kelthas Redfield, and a colleague confirmed, adding that he had resigned as leader of the Royal Knights to immediately become a professor. Another assistant remarked on the remarkable yet potentially troublesome arrival, wondering if a new student had joined the autonomous major. This person then lamented the end of their easy essay-based existence, realizing they would now have to prepare lesson plans. The murmurs of complaint continued as the staff discussed the upcoming changes. Meanwhile, Professor Kelthas was feeling a headache coming on. The orientation for the new students was slowly coming to an end, and this situation was beyond belief. He wondered why it had to be the top student now. He then turned his gaze toward Dane in front of him and asked if he must be Dane Sogres, noting that he was there early. Hearing his name being called, Dane turned around and gave a polite bow, saying hello professor, and that it was a pleasure to meet him. All right, come in, Kelthas responded quickly, inviting Dane into his office. Once they entered, Professor Kelthas couldn't help but complain about his unfortunate fate, saying he had worked so hard to get this position and came there to rest, not to teach students, admitting that even being a guide for knights had worn him out. After a moment of grumbling, Professor Kelthas became curious and asked why Dane had applied to the autonomous major. Because I want to do whatever I want, Dane answered calmly. Professor Kelthas raised an eyebrow and asked if he had ever considered switching to the autonomous major system. Dane shook his head, saying no, he hadn't. Professor Kelthas's expression darkened slightly at the response, thinking that if that was the case, then he had no choice but to guide him. He pondered for a moment and then asked if Dane knew any swordsmanship, clarifying that he wasn't trying to offend him, but that at least since he was in the autonomous major and Professor Kelthas was his professor, he should have some level of skill in swordsmanship. Dane immediately sensed something wasn't right, feeling an ulterior motive. He thought that the sudden mention of swordsmanship didn't feel like a warm welcome at all. He frowned and replied that it wasn't that he wasn't interested in swordsmanship. Upon hearing this, Professor Kelthas immediately stood up from his chair, a glint of excitement in his eyes, saying, all right, then how about they test it right now? Dane nodded nonchalantly, saying sure. Professor Kelthas's face lit up with a smile, clearly pleased, thinking he had got him now, and suggesting they head to his practice field. Professor Kelthas had an agenda. As a professor, he had the authority to evaluate students, and he was planning to use Dane's apparent lack of swordsmanship as an excuse to fail him. He reasoned that if he could show Dane's awkwardness with a sword, he could easily dismiss him from the autonomous major. The scene then shifted to the training room, where Professor Kelthas reminded Dane that there were plenty of swords there and to choose whichever one he wanted. Yes, Professor, Dane nodded, scanning the swords laid out nearby. However, the sight of the swords haphazardly placed alongside trash scattered across the floor disappointed him. This is the training field? Even without students in the autonomous major, this is a bit much, Dane thought to himself, sighing internally. He then decided to pick up a sword that seemed suitable enough and Professor asked if this one was enough. Yes, this one will do, Dane replied confidently. Professor Kelthas began to explain the rules, stating that if Dane could land even a single hit on him with that sword, he would pass, assuring him it wasn't difficult because he would only move within 2 steps. His self-assurance was evident, but he didn't know that standing in front of him was a top-tier swordsman. Understood, Dane said calmly, telling him to begin. Professor Kelthas, with a cold tone, was also pondering, wondering if Dane's calm acceptance of the conditions meant he was confident. He didn't have long to think before Dane lunged forward and initiated his attack. Dane aimed his sword at Professor Kelthas's waist. It was a quick move, but Professor Kelthas easily dodged to the side. However, Dane's speed caught him by surprise. Professor Kelthas watched the young man move, a thought flashing through his mind about the boy's incredible speed and whether that was the reason for his placement in the autonomous major. Before he could fully process this, Dane's sword was upon him again, even faster than the first time. The weapon moved with a mechanical precision, forcing Professor Kelthas to raise his own sword in a block, pushing Dane's attack away. A nervous swallow went down as Professor Kelthas thought how close that had been. He mused that Dane used an unusual sword style, wondering if the boy was simply a fool who knew how to swing a blade. Yet the way he moved was more like a seasoned battlefield swordsman than a noble or a knight. Professor Kelthas furrowed his brow, lost in thought, but his analysis was cut short as Dane charged once more. The young man's form became a blur of motion, his sword striking from every possible angle. Professor Kelthas struggled to keep up, finding it incredibly difficult to block and deflect each relentless attack. The sheer speed and accuracy of Dane's strikes forced Professor Kelthas into a constant retreat and defense. This was not the fight he had anticipated. As the exchange continued, it became increasingly challenging for Professor Kelthas to maintain his guard. He thought in disbelief about being level 6 and struggling so much against what he believed was a 14-year-old who didn't even require a handicap. However, something about Dane's movement sparked a strange familiarity, stirring an old memory within Professor Kelthas. He recalled a time on the battlefield when he had witnessed an enemy soldier employing an exceptionally powerful sword technique. He remembered there being someone incredibly strong in the Draenic Empire, but this individual wore no medals or insignia of knighthood. While Professor Kelthas was lost in these recollections, Dane seized the opportunity and delivered a swift strike towards his flank. However, the moment his sword made contact with Professor Kelthas' body, Dane stopped, marking the end of the test. Looking down at the sword that had touched him, Professor Kelthas inwardly cursed his lapse in concentration. Meanwhile, seeing that he had landed a touch, Dane allowed himself a satisfied smile as he sheathed his weapon. He then addressed the professor, stating calmly that he believed he had met the requirement. Despite his initial reluctance, Professor Kelthas had to admit that Dane had indeed passed. He gave the young man a scrutinizing look, his mind racing. He considered the boy a genius, an extraordinary one at that. Even with the handicap, Dane had kept pace with someone at his level. Realizing Dane's exceptional talent in swordsmanship, Professor Kelthas couldn't contain his curiosity and inquired why he hadn't applied for the swordsmanship department with such skills. Dane answered with a quiet confidence that his family would likely be disappointed. Professor Kelthas was taken aback by this response, but soon recalled Dane's background. His father was a master spearman and his two sisters were masters of magic and summoning. Professor Kelthas surmised that Dane had probably chosen his current path to meet his family's expectations. He had completely misunderstood Dane's true reasons and mistakenly thought the boy lacked confidence in swordsmanship. Dane, unaware of Professor Kelthas' internal thoughts, asked the professor if everything had been confirmed. Snapping back to reality, Professor Kelthas quickly nodded, telling Dane that he could go and that he would send the official notice soon. Dane thanked the professor, bowed respectfully, and swiftly left the room. Watching Dane's retreating figure, Professor Kelthas sighed deeply, feeling like a failure. He imagined the department heads who had judged Dane felt the same way. All his plans to get the boy out of the autonomous major and living comfortably had gone up in smoke. As Dane left the training room, Kelthas couldn't help but think of a particular individual. The Imperial Knights were tasked with protecting the Imperial family, but there was one instance when they were deployed to the front lines against the Draenic Empire for battlefield inspection. It was there that Kelthas had witnessed a formidable enemy warrior who ruthlessly cut down knights of the Althian Empire. This warrior wore no insignia or markings to indicate knighthood, simply light armor, and wielded two unadorned swords. None of the knights who encountered him proved to be a match. His swordsmanship was unconventional, born from the harsh realities of the battlefield, and if a sword broke, he would fight with the broken piece or pick up another weapon to continue the fight. Kelthas strained to recall the name of this impressive enemy knight. A hollow laugh escaped Kelthas's lips, his expression a mixture of surprise and resignation. Then, a name suddenly surfaced in his mind. Argric, the warrior born and died on the battlefield, once praised by Duke Thermion. That's a wrap. The story continues in my next video. Like and subscribe to stay notified.